Welcome back to large-scale machine learning. So for this part, we'll be talking about CPU versus memory constraint in machine learning. So CPU or memory constraint in machine learning. So assuming that you have determined from your learning curve that actually you need more data in order to improve the performance of the model. So once you determine that, then you need to ask yourself, what is the main constraint that you face in as you try to actually use a larger data set and build a model? Is it bound by the CPU or is it bound by the memory? What is meant by CPU bound? So assuming after plotting the learning curve, you find that actually more data will actually improve the model. However, that we face another problem while training the model with more data due to the limitation of our CPU or GPU power. We don't basically have a fast enough processor to run, and it takes simply too long to do the training. So the data may require a very long time for training, for example, more than a day. This is especially true for complex algorithms such as support vector machines with a polynomial kernel, or for deep learning neural networks, a very large deep neural learning neural network with many layers and many weights to actually update. So this kind of algorithms, they generate large models which takes a very long time to train. So the constraint here is that we don't have enough CPU power or GPU power. We don't have enough computational power to be able to do the training in a reasonable amount of time. Uh, Secondly, some models, which are what we call ensemble models, they are based on combining several learners together, and each of these learners may take a long time. So if you combine 100 estimators together, so let's say you have a random forest kind of ensemble model with 100 estimators, then it's going to take a long time to train this. Other ensemble models include the gradient boosted models. They also require a large number of estimators to this. A stacked model will also require multiple simpler machine learning models, but each of them may take a long time to train. So lastly, hyperparameter tuning itself, which is a process of adjusting hyperparameters and then using something like grid search or random search to see if the performance would improve. This is basically an exhaustive search method, and it's going to take a very long time to actually go through a long list of possible combinations of hyperparameters. So again, this is a case where we will be limited by the amount of CPU power that we can have at our disposal to actually run this grid search. So sometimes because of the limitation, we actually have to reduce the size of the hyperparameter search so that we may not get the most optimal values simply because we don't have enough time to actually run through the entire list. And of course, combinations of each of these factors would just make it more complex, right? For example, you need to have a large ensemble model, and also you need to have a hyperparameter search for each of the different models within your ensemble. So this just makes it n times more complicated than any one of them individually. So this is a case where it is basically bound, what we call CPU bound. It's actually we don't have enough computational or processing power to run it fast enough. So your strategy in actually implementing a large-scale machine learning would depend upon the type of scaling problem that you are facing. So there are a couple of different scaling problems that you might face, and the scaling strategy would actually depend on the kind of problem. So the first one, which we were just talking about just now, is a CPU bound problem. That means we don't have enough computational power, and the data actually is not so large. The training data can fit within the RAM of the computer, but it's just that it takes too long to actually adjust the algorithm to train using this data. So it's not actually affected by memory as much as the processing power. And there are many hyperparameter combinations to try, so a large grid search is necessary. Or lastly, there's actually a very large ensemble of various models that you try to combine together. So for CPU bound, if you imagine a quadrant like this where we have model size on the vertical axis, so a small model and moving up is a larger model, and take a larger model takes basically more computations, processing power is required versus the memory size. So small memory size, and then as the training data increases, we need more and more memory. So RAM bound means that it's falling over here. But let's talk about CPU. CPU bound, the data fits within the RAM, but the amount of CPU required is very large. Now, the second kind of problem is what we call the memory bound problem, where the training data is basically very large. You have a couple of million of rows of data, and it cannot be actually fitted within the RAM of the computer. And in this case, the learning curves indicate to us that we cannot just do reduce undersampling. We cannot just sample the data such that we reduce the overall size, because that will actually decrease the performance of the model. So we need to have sufficient data because the relationship may be very complex or the number of features are very large. So sampling is not an option, so we somehow need to be training the model over the large data set, and we have to think of a strategy to actually fit in the data into the RAM so that we can proceed with the training. Because obviously, if you require 1 terabyte of RAM, there's no way that you can actually find a machine with that amount of RAM. So you need to think of a strategy to do this. And lastly, we will talk about the nice case where the data just fits nicely within the RAM and it doesn't require too much computational power. So we actually do not need the large-scale machine learning techniques. So we can just use scikit-learn or similar techniques to handle this. So if your data set is not too large, it fits comfortably within the RAM, and your model isn't too complex, right? Not too large so that you do not need to have a distributed machine learning like Dask. Then you are basically in this nice golden quadrant down here, the bottom left quadrant, and you are basically better off using something like scikit-learn or XGBoost or any other similar libraries. Distributed machine learning is more complex to implement, and it's really for the case where it's either CPU bound or memory or RAM bound. So if you are not running into those kind of problems as described before, and you can undersample or sample down the data so that it can fit within the RAM, then basically don't use all these other fancy distributed machine learning. You can just survive and probably do a good job just using scikit-learn and similar libraries. So another way to think about the problem, again, we have this two scales of this problem, like the model size, how much computation you need on the vertical axis, and the data size, how much RAM space you need to actually do the training, how much training samples are there. Now, previously we had vertical axis, but actually for many problems, it's actually a combination of the two, right? You have some amount of CPU constraint and some amount of RAM constraints. Never a pure case that is purely RAM constraint or purely CPU constraints. Normally a combination of the two. So if everything fits nicely within the RAM and it sort of doesn't take too much CPU resource to do this, then you can just use your scikit-learn library to actually solve this problem, right? There's no need to do any distributed machine learning or other scaling techniques that we would be talking about in large-scale machine learning. So the techniques that you learned that doesn't require distribution or distributed learning, you can just use them. And there are, besides scikit-learn, we have other libraries like XGBoost, etc. And if we actually find that scikit-learn alone is not good enough because your problem is requiring a lot of computational power, maybe more than what one single computer can provide, right? So you need a cluster or a group of computers or workstations to work on it rather than just one single laptop. Then you need what we call distributed algorithms, distributed version of scikit-learn. One of them is what we call the Dask or DASK library, which we will talk about afterwards. But this techniques basically means that we are trying to do distributed machine learning rather than trying to focus on just one single machine, because there's no way that beyond a certain number of cores on your laptop, you will always run into a problem eventually if the problem is big enough, This threshold obviously would shift with time as the individual machines get more and more powerful, but there will always be a threshold beyond which you cannot solve the problem on one single machine anymore. And you actually need to spread the load over a number of machines in the cluster. So these are actually the kind of techniques that we'll be talking about later, how we can do distributed machine learning or distributed computing. So instead of doing the training on one machine, you do the training over a number of machines working together. Now, if your data actually is not really, your model is not really CPU bound, but actually the other problem, RAM bound, right? Then the techniques that you use, you cannot just rely on disputing the computations across multiple machines. You need to think about algorithms that can actually work on the data piece by piece, right? So one of the ways, of course, if you can sample, just do this, because sampling will just bring you down to the sweet spot, right? You can just use simple techniques to handle it. But if your problem is really that complex and you cannot just downsample the data, then no choice. You have to think about other out-of-core algorithms. Basically, these out-of-core algorithms are algorithms that can run without the entire data set being loaded into the RAM at the same time. You will still go through the entire training set. It's just that you do not need to load everything into RAM at the same time when we are doing the training. And of course, there are also other scalable algorithms that we can use in other libraries. So we cannot simply spread the workload over a number of machines, because this is not a problem just with the CPU power, but it's actually a problem with the amount of data that you need, or training data that you need to run through the algorithm. So you need to have smarter algorithms that do not require you to actually have the whole training set inside RAM at the same time. So here's a quick quiz for you. Our training set is 1 GB in size, so this is pretty large. And we have a terabyte laptop with 32 GB of RAM. Our laptop has a 10-core i7 CPU. When building a random forest model with 500 estimators, we find that the training time is taking several hours, taking too huge a time, because this is an ensemble model. This type of problem is called what? Is this memory bound, CPU bound, GPU bound, or is it cluster bound? What is this problem called? So you should pause the video and then attempt to answer this before you move on to the further part of the video. So pause a while to answer this. So here's the next quiz. So I'm assuming that our training set is 78 GB in size. So this is really huge data set. We have a laptop with 32 gig of RAM. Our laptop has a 10-core i7 processor, and we want to build a random forest model with 500 estimators. What is this type of problem called? A, memory bound, B, CPU bound, C, GPU bound, or D, cluster bound? So again, pause the video a while and then think of the answer before proceeding. And with that, we come to the end of this set of videos. Thank you for your attention.